and the inflation rate rises. The higher inflation rate causes, along the MP curve, a higher real interest rate. Now, we're in short-run equilibrium, but not long-run equilibrium. So we know that inflation expectations will change, causing the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift, in this case, downward. Where do we end up? Where do we achieve general equilibrium again? At the same spot we started at, right? At the same spot. So we get this negative shock, and boom, 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 down comes the short-run aggregate supply curve through the adjustment mechanism until we get back to the same general equilibrium that we had before. Output is back at potential, and the inflation rate is back at our target level. Inflation has come back down, economic output has gone up. With inflation coming back down, the real interest rate comes back down as we move back along the monetary policy curve. There has been no change in the real interest rate, and therefore no change in the equilibrium real interest rate. That's kind of boring. Okay, now let's take scenario number 2. General equilibrium, target inflation rate to start with. Again, a temporary negative aggregate supply shock, but now the central bank is going to target the inflation rate. So the first part should be the same. The short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up. Economic output falls to Y1A. And inflation rises to pi 1A. So the first part of this is exactly the same. Inflation goes up. We also move up along our monetary policy curve to a higher real interest rate. But remember, now we've got that higher real interest rate. The central bank doesn't want a higher inflation rate. The central bank is targeting inflation down here. So what does the central bank need to do in the year of this shock? Okay. So what we need is a contractionary monetary policy. So the aggregate demand curve needs to shift way far to the left. Now we're back at our target inflation rate. Right? So the inflation rate has come down. The problem with this is that economic output has fallen even more. So wow, we managed to keep inflation at a target level, but now we've got a much larger deviation in the output gap, or output relative to potential, or a much larger unemployment gap. But a central bank with a hierarchical mandate for price stability would have to do this. Now, you might think this would never happen, right? Central banks are smarter than this. So in 2008 and 2009, when we had the severe part of the economic crisis, not only did economic activity in the United States go down, it also went down globally, in particular in Europe. And in second half of 2009 and 2010, the economy started to grow again, both in the United States and in Europe. But in 2011, there was a jump in oil prices, reflecting the Arab Spring turmoil in the Middle East. With higher oil prices, right, a negative supply shock, the European Central Bank, which has as its only objective of price stability, saw inflation rise. They raised interest rates. Despite the fact that unemployment was quite high in the euro region, if your goal is to keep inflation way back here, they raised interest rates, causing the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. And Europe went back into recession. Oops. And now they're sitting there with euro area-wide unemployment of about 12%, and in some countries as high as 25%. In retrospect, probably not the best strategy. And now, of course, because of this very large negative output gap and changes in other things like confidence and consumer optimism, inflation's no longer just below but close to 2%. Inflation in the euro region is 0.4%. Doesn't need much more before we get into deflation on a euro-wide basis. We already have deflation in some of the southern European countries. Now, we're not done here. So one of the things, this is just year 1. So what would happen in year 2? Oh, wait a minute, we didn't do the monetary policy curve, did we? So the monetary policy curve would have to shift way up. This brings inflation back down. That causes the real interest rate to rise. So we're way up here. Ouch. Now, if we go back to the aggregate demand and supply curves, what do we see? We're at a short-term equilibrium here. This is not long-run equilibrium. So what's going to happen in year 2? Okay. So actual inflation is at pi 1. Expected inflation is in year 2, expected inflation will equal actual inflation in year 1. Right? So expected inflation has to equal actual inflation in year 1. But remember, where actual inflation equals expected inflation is long-run equilibrium, which in our diagram would be right back here, where we started from. So the next thing in year 2, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts back down to its original location. Not because actual inflation was different, but because actual inflation was, different than expected inflation, but it wasn't in the long run equilibrium position, which will be right here. So when that happens, now the economy begins to improve. Inflation now is too low, and the economy has begun to improve a bit. Whoops, now inflation's too low. So what does the central bank have to do? Now we have to switch to a expansionary policy. In fact, we have to go back to right where we were. And then that'll take us to point 2, where now with all these gyrations, economic output is back at potential, and the inflation rate is still at the target rate. And that expansionary policy takes the MP curve right back down to where it was before. Inflation is at our target level, and the interest rate comes back to its original level. So the real interest rate the equilibrium real interest rate does not change. Just like we saw in scenario 1. The equilibrium real interest rate doesn't change regardless of what the central bank does. Again, the equilibrium real interest rate is determined by saving and investing decisions, not by monetary policy. Again, think about what's happening with the IS curve. So if we look at the IS curve and we think about a negative short-run aggregate supply shock, well, we don't draw the negative. It doesn't show up here. Now we know that caused economic output to fall, right? So we move back along our IS curve. That higher inflation gave us a higher real interest rate, so we move back. But that's a short-run phenomenon. Unless the IS curve shifts or the long-run aggregate supply curve, potential output changes, there's not going to be a change in the equilibrium real interest rate. But what we see in this example is even though the equilibrium real interest rate does not change, the central bank is causing much bigger swings in economic output. If they did nothing, we fall to Y1A. By targeting inflation, we fall all the way to Y1. That's creating a lot of unemployment to maintain an inflation target. You better be pretty sure that the cost of that higher inflation is actually worth that trade-off. So notice now there is a trade-off, so there's a conflict. The divine coincidence does not hold with short-run aggregate supply shocks. Now, rather than thinking about targeting inflation, let's suppose they decide instead, same temporary negative short-run aggregate supply shock, they try to stabilize economic output. So the first part of this is exactly the same. Economic output falls. Inflation rises. Higher inflation leads to a higher real interest rate. But now we have a short-run equilibrium. It's not long-run equilibrium. And the central bank was going to target either economic output at potential or the unemployment rate at the natural rate. So they want to bring economic output back to potential. How do we do that? It must be an expansionary policy, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. Notice what happens. Yes, we can keep the economy at potential, but we would also end up with a permanently higher inflation rate. So notice that if you want to stabilize economic output, you can't stabilize inflation. If you want to stabilize inflation, you can't stabilize economic output when you're faced with a temporary aggregate supply shock. There will be a trade-off. So what happens then? Again, we have a conflict. The divine coincidence does not hold. So what we can say then is that if most of the shocks to the economy are aggregate demand shocks, then a central bank can target inflation and not have to worry about unemployment or economic output. Targeting inflation will also achieve a zero output gap and a zero unemployment gap. If most of the shocks to the economy are long-run aggregate supply shocks, the same thing is true. A central bank that targets inflation will also be targeting a zero output gap or a zero unemployment gap. So these are the kinds of shocks that central bankers would really like to have. However, if most of the shocks to the economy are short-run aggregate supply shocks, now a trade-off exists. By targeting inflation, you make bigger variations in economic output gap or the unemployment gap. In the short run. In the long run, when we finally get back to general equilibrium, again, there's no trade-off. You can target inflation. But we also see that if you target unemployment, you're also going to get much more variability in terms of inflation. So whether or not a central bank should be an inflation-targeting central bank really depends upon the kind of shocks that it would see. So when we look around again at the United States, we have an elevated unemployment rate, and we have inflation below the target. Looks like a demand shock. If we could shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, then we could have higher output and higher inflation. The same thing is true in Europe. An elevated unemployment rate and a below target inflation rate says, let's target inflation. We can get inflation up. We can also get the unemployment rate down. Remember, on Tuesday, Veterans Day, so if we have any veterans here, thank you for your service. Do not arrive here in class at 3:30 or 3:40. Well, if you do, I won't be here. So have a nice day off, and I'll see you next Thursday.